Hey guys, Will here. So today we're going to be taking a look at the RTX 5090 from a slightly different perspective. By now I'm sure most of you guys have seen the general gaming benchmarks that all the usual suspects on YouTube have done an awesome job at getting out there. But those kinds of tests and benchmarks aren't always indicative of the kind of performance uplift that you might see on a typical sim rig. Now, given that this is such an expensive card, I'm going to be assuming here that most people that are in the market for a card like this already have pretty high-end screens or a high-end VR headset. So what I did was I upgraded my existing system from a 4090 to the 5090, tested it out with my triple 4K setup as well as the Pimax Crystal Light. And today I'm going to be sharing with you the results that I saw. And there were some pretty surprising things here, some things that had me scratching my head for certain. So yeah, I'm going to be sharing that with you today. Let's dive in and check it out. So firstly, just want to say another big thank you to Optimum Tech for very kindly loaning us his 5090 so that we could get the content that we wanted to out around the launch of this new graphics card. As you guys might have seen, I did attempt to purchase one of these cards for myself around the launch, but as was the experience for most of you guys as well, had absolutely no luck in doing so. Hopefully we'll be able to pick up our own card relatively soon. As soon as they are available, I will be buying one. But yeah, we were somewhat limited in the amount of time that we had with this card, and given a lot of the issues that we've been seeing as well with melted connectors and things like that, I did want to try and minimize the amount of usage that I put on somebody else's card. So we will be doing some more extensive testing and filling in some of the blanks from this video over the coming months when we can finally get our hands on our own card. But yeah, another massive thank you to Optimum Tech for very kindly making today's video possible. Also just want to let you guys know as well that the Pimax Crystal Light headset that you see on the table in front of me here was provided by Pimax for testing and evaluation purposes. You might have seen we did a video about 6 months ago now comparing the experience with the big triple 4K displays to the Pimax Crystal Light. So you can check that video out, linked down in the description below, and we will have some more content coming up pretty soon on this headset as well. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out on that. But yeah, with all that said, let's dive in now and talk about the experience upgrading to the 5090. So I want to start this out by telling you a little bit more about the system that it went into and just establishing a little bit more of a baseline here. So the system is the one that's sitting behind me. It was previously running a 4090 Strix card from ROG, and that is the OC edition. So I was actually running that at a power limit of 120% when I was gaming normally. I wound that back down to 100% for these tests, so it's more indicative of the performance that you would see from a standard 4090 rather than an OC edition. Now that 4090 was running the standard ASUS cooler. Now the rest of the system consists of a Intel 14900K processor, overclocked to about 5.6 gigahertz on a couple of cores, winding down to about 5 gigahertz if all of the cores are loaded up. 64 gig of DDR5 RAM running at 5000 megahertz, and a 2 terabyte Samsung 980 Pro M2 storage device. So no bottlenecks there in terms of storage. Also, just to let you know as well, we are running a vertical GPU riser in that PC. It is a Gen 4 PCIe riser, and we do have the motherboard locked to Gen 4 PCIe. So we weren't able to take advantage of Gen 5 here. Some other benchmarks have noticed a small increase in performance with the 5090 when using Gen 5. That's, you know, we're only talking a couple of percent at absolute most there, but just wanted to disclose that for you guys because it will have a slight impact on the results that we're seeing today. So firstly, we'll go through the results running triple 4K, and then we'll get into the results that we saw with the Pimax Crystal Light headset a little bit later on. I have put chapters down below as well, so if you are only interested in the VR performance, you can skip straight to that part of the video, and that will give you the information that you're after. Now, I was really hoping to test out triple 1440 resolution as part of this video as well. Unfortunately, you guys might have seen last week I did a video talking about how I was having issues with the card basically soft bricking itself every time I changed resolution. So running the native resolution wasn't any issue at all, but as soon as I changed it down to 1440, the screens would go dark, and then the PC just wouldn't recognize the graphics card anymore, and I'd actually have to run DDU or driver uninstall to completely wipe the PC or the driver to even get it to recognize the card again. And then if I fired it back up, would run perfectly fine in native 4K. As soon as I change the resolution, the same thing would happen again. So again, it's something that I'll explore in more detail once I have my hands on my own card, but I just ran out of time to try and troubleshoot it, unfortunately, for this video. So as I said earlier, we literally just upgraded straight from the 4090 to the 5090, didn't change anything else in the PC. So this should give those of you who are looking at a similar upgrade a good indication of exactly what kind of real world performance increase you might see from this upgrade. So before we get into the numbers, just a couple of notes on testing methodology here. We are just looking at raw performance of the card here. So exact same settings between the 4090 and the 5090. We're not looking at frame generation or any of those new DLSS related features. That's something that we will unpack later on when I've got more time with my own card and can really sort of get stuck into that in more detail. So yeah, just plain raw performance here. Now the testing methodology in terms of what we actually did for iRacing was to record a race against a full field of AI cars, save that replay and then play the replay back from cockpit view with both the 4090 and the 5090. So what we're actually seeing on screen should be pretty much identical between the two cards. That to me seemed like the best way to try and get as clean a result as possible. So let's have a look at the numbers now. So with the 4090 at a resolution of 11520 by 2160 or triple 4K, we saw an average frame rate of 72 frames per second with a 1% low of 54 frames per second. Now swapping over to the 5090, that jumped up to 88 frames per second average with a 1% low of 64 frames per second. So that equates to a 23% increase in raw performance there between the two cards. Now, interestingly, the power draw between the two averaged out across the entire duration of the test, which was about 2 laps for this particular test, was 456 watts average with the 4090. That jumped up to a whopping 556 watts average with the 5090s. So we definitely are seeing a pretty significant increase in power draw there. Remembering that is just the power draw of the graphics card. That's not including CPU and the rest of your system as well. So you're definitely going to be wanting to have a pretty beefy power supply if you are looking at upgrading to one of these cards. So that was our results in iRacing. Taking a look at Assetto Corsa Competizione now. So here again, I recorded a race against a full field of AI cars and then went back to the cockpit cam in replay mode and ran the same test across both cards. In this case, again, we were running 11520 by 2160, so triple 4K. And I have the graphics settings in ACC configured such that I get a playable frame rate with maximum visual quality. So we end up running very high to ultra settings with DLSS set to balanced here. So with the 4090 running triple 4K, we do only get 56 frames per second average with a 1% low of 41. Look, honestly, with the triple 4K displays with G-Sync, it is relatively smooth to my eye at least. I don't have too many problems, but obviously a higher frame rate would be nice. So yeah, 56 frames per second average with the 4090. And with the 5090 running the exact same test, that was bumped up to just under 70 frames per second, so 68 frames per second average with a 1% low of 51 frames per second. So that is a performance uplift of 22%, so 22% faster with the 5090. And look, that was a very significant jump. So it did look visually a lot smoother. The increase from 71 to 87 in iRacing wasn't so noticeable to my eye, but that jump in performance was definitely noticeable in Assetto Corsa Competizione. And look, it basically gives me the option of cranking the graphics up even further if I want to, or just being happy with having a smoother experience overall with the same visual quality. So that is the real world benefit that you derive from that increase in performance in Assetto Corsa Competizione. I would say that was probably the game that had the biggest impact on the overall experience of playing, with maybe the exception of Assetto Corsa Evo that we'll get into in just a second. So next up was the test of F1 24, again running triple 4K, so 11520 by 2160. And with F1 24, I do tend to configure my graphics settings to allow me to run a higher frame rate to begin with, simply because things are happening so quickly on screen. You really have to be able to react very quickly. So I run sort of mid to high settings here for F1 24. So that gives me an average frame rate at triple 4K resolution of 85 frames per second with a 1% low of 64 frames per second. Switching over to the 5090, we see that average frame rate jump up to 104 frames per second with a 1% low of 68 frames per second. So an average frame rate increase again of 23%, pretty much exactly the same as what we saw in AC and iRacing. So good to have that consistency there. And just like what we saw before as well, a jump from 450 watts or thereabouts up to 530 watts in F1 24. So again, you are paying for it in power. Look, I mean, that increase in frame rate to my eyes doesn't have a huge huge impact on the actual real world experience of playing the game. But again, it does give you the freedom to increase your graphics settings that little bit further if that's something that's important to you whilst maintaining a playable frame rate. So if that's something that's, is important to you, then that is the real world benefit that you're going to see from the upgrade to a 5090 from a 4090 in F124. Next up was Assetto Corsa Evo, which I was really interested to see because you guys would know this game is very hard on the graphics card, at least at this point in time in early access. So yeah, with the triple 4K resolution, with the 4090, we were seeing an average frame rate. And again, I do have the graphics cranked up pretty high here just to try and get the visual quality as good as it can possibly be while still being somewhat playable. So with the 4090, I was getting an average frame rate of 49 frames per second with a 1% low of 30 frames per second. So it is right on the edge of what I would consider playable. Switching over to the 5090 with the exact same visual settings, that jumps up to 58 frames per second with a 36 frame per second, 1% low. So that equates to a 19% performance increase there running the exact same settings. Now, interestingly here, I did notice that the total power draw for both the 4090 and the 5090 was lower than it had been in the previous test. So with the 4090, we were averaging 333 watts, whereas with the 5090, we were averaging 450 watts. Now, the GPU utilization here was still sitting at around 98%, which is the same as what it was for most of the other titles. So I'm not sure exactly what's going on here. Maybe we are running into a little bit of a CPU bottleneck and that is winding back, or maybe it's just a little bit less demanding on the GPU in general. But yeah, I'm not exactly certain, so I'm not going to pretend like I know exactly what's going on there, but there was a slightly lower power draw in Assetto Corsa Evo than we saw in the other games up to this point. So if you can explain that to me in lieu of any decrease in GPU utilization or any obvious CPU bottlenecking, let me know in the comments down below. And yeah, I'd love to try and get to the bottom of exactly what's going on there. So again, look, I mean, it gives us the ability to, have a more playable frame rate there with high graphics settings in triple 4K resolution, but obviously also gives us the ability to crank the graphics up a little bit higher once again if we're comfortable playing at those lower frame rates. But 60 frames per second, 50 frames per second is low for sim racing and not what I would recommend for most people in the first place. So having that extra headroom does have a positive impact there, does give you a little bit more freedom, but it's certainly not the kind of increase that I was maybe hoping for there. I was hoping maybe we might see things jump up as high as like 70, 80 frames per second without having to crank the graphics down too much. But yeah, running triple 4K resolution there is still pretty taxing even with the 5090, as you might expect for a latest generation sim racing title. So that is what you can expect from Assetto Corsa Evo if you're wanting to run triple 4K resolution. And then we did a final test in Le Mans Ultimate here as well. Now this is where we did actually start to run into some CPU bottlenecking, unfortunately, with the 5090. So the test was kind of invalidated, I guess you could say, but just to give you an idea here, it was a little bit strange. So we saw an average frame rate with the 4090 of 68 frames per second with a 1% low of 44 frames per second. And then when we switched over to the 5090 running the exact same settings, the frame rate was actually lower. So it jumped down to 64 frames per second with a 1% low of 44 frames per second. So the 1% low was pretty much exactly the same, but the average frame rate was actually a little bit lower than with the 4090. But when we look at the GPU utilization here, it was 94.6% with the 4090, whereas that dropped down to 68.9% with the 5090. So initially when I looked at the CPU utilization here, I was only seeing 28% utilization, but then when I actually went into Hardware Manager and had a look at what was going on with the individual cores, I could see that with the 5090, it was actually maxing out a couple of cores at 100% load. So what was happening, from my observation at least, and I may be wrong here, but what I think was happening is that we were hitting a CPU bottleneck on a couple of cores. It's obviously not utilizing all the cores that are available to it. And yeah, that was having an impact on performance. So it was interesting that we weren't seeing that bottlenecking with the 4090. The CPU utilization for each core was sitting at around the kind of 90% mark. But as soon as we put the 5090 in, it did max out at 100%. So yeah, lower frame rate with the 5090, all other things being equal here. Interestingly as well, the power consumption with the 5090 was ever so slightly higher, even though we were getting a lower frame rate here. So 367 watts average with the 4090, 389 watts average with the 5090, despite the utilization being 95% with the 4090 and 69% with the 5090. So yeah, 7% slower in the end, but obviously CPU bound there, so an invalid result. But again, we are just sort of showing with you guys what you can expect from doing the exact same upgrade that we've done here or something similar. So we definitely were, with all these games, getting very close to being CPU bound with the 14900K. Unfortunately, I don't have a 9800 X3D here at the moment that I could test with, but we will be purchasing one of those very soon. So hopefully by the time we get our hands on our own 5090, we'll be able to do some further testing to see how that goes. So yeah, across the board there, in all instances where we didn't end up running into a CPU bound state, we saw around about a 20 to 23% increase in performance from the 5090 at triple 4K resolution, which is pretty much in line with what we were seeing from benchmarks at lower resolutions with general gaming as well. So we've seen people reporting somewhere between about a 20 to 30% increase in performance generally across the board, going from a 4090 to a 5090, and that is what we see represented here in triple 4K resolution for sim racing as well. So that brings us to the VR test, and this is where things got a little bit more crazy. So let's dive into the numbers now, and I'll take you through exactly what we saw. So again, the testing methodology here was to basically configure my graphics settings with the 4090, so I was getting as playable an experience as I possibly could. So that meant in the case of iRacing, I was actually already maxing out at the frame cap of 90 frames per second with the 4090. And again, the aim here is to try and represent for you guys, the real world performance increase that you would get if you're looking at this kind of an upgrade. So look, the reality is the 4090 already does a really good job in iRacing. You're able to, with the Pimax Crystal Light, achieve a average frame rate of 90 frames per second. So running 90 Hertz mode on the Pimax headset, obviously there's no real benefit from running frame rates any higher than 90 frames per second anyway. So we're already getting good performance with the graphics pretty much maxed out. And the 4090 seems to actually achieve that in iRacing with relative ease as well. We're actually only running 72% GPU utilization to achieve that with the 4090 with a power draw of just under 300 watts, 299 watts average. So average of 90 frames per second there, obviously frame capped as we were saying before, with a 1% low of 76 frames per second. Switching out to the 5090, obviously we weren't expecting an increase in average frames because we're frame capped. 1% low there was pretty much exactly the same as well. GPU utilization was down to 61.5% with the 5090 as opposed to 72% with the 4090. So it's not having to work as hard to achieve the same results as you would of course expect. And that means that our power draw is lighter with the 5090 as well. So the 4090, as I said before, 299 watts. The 5090 was down to 260 watts, or less than half of its TDP there. But look, I mean, my take there is that if you're already running a 4090 for iRacing and you're playing iRacing specifically, you're probably not really going to benefit from the upgrade to a 5090 realistically, from what I can see here, all other things being equal. And, as I said, we already pretty much have the graphics maxed out anyway, so you're not really going to be getting any boost in visual quality either. You would be able to run a little bit more anti-aliasing, but again, with this headset, I don't really see a massive benefit in doing that anyway. So maybe save your cash there. Although if we move on to Assetto Corsa Competizione, we saw an absolutely massive increase in performance upgrading to the 5090. Now this is more in line with what we've seen from some other early reports of VR performance with the 5090. A lot of people are saying that this is a bit of a monster for VR, and that's definitely what we observed here. So ACC has always been a bit of a struggle for me in VR. It's just not particularly well optimized in my opinion. And what that's meant is that it's always a trade-off between the frame rate or visual quality. You really have to crank the graphics quite far down to get a decent frame rate in an ACC, or at least you have had to up until this point. So with the 4090, to have things in the distance looking crisp and not sort of all blurry and just to the point of being immersion breaking, I was only able to achieve a frame rate of 43 frames per second. And that is with the resolution scaling on the headset down at 80% as well, which again is just done to balance out the visual quality against the frame rate here. So yeah, average frame rate of 43 frames per second with a 1% low of 36. But then jumping across to the 5090 with the exact same settings, we see a massive increase up to 65 frames per second from the previous 43 frames per second. So that is a 52% increase in performance, which is absolutely game changing. So that meant that I was able able to, at the same graphics settings, actually have a playable experience. Now, unfortunately, we're still nowhere near that 90 frames per second that we would be hoping to achieve, but definitely makes the game at least playable, and you do have the option, of course, of cranking the graphics down further. What I was able to do was increase my resolution scaling up to 100% to take full advantage of the quality of the panels in this headset and still maintain around sort of 50 to 55 frames per second without having to make too much compromise in terms of the visual quality settings inside the game. So yeah, definitely if you're playing a lot of VR in ACC and you've got a high-end headset like this, you will definitely see a worthwhile performance increase from the 4090 to the 5090, assuming, of course, that you've got a CPU that is up to the task. And again, we were very, very, very close to being CPU bound, even with an overclocked 14900K. So just be mindful of that. Unfortunately, I can't tell you whether there would be any further performance increase with a more high-end CPU, but I would definitely suggest, and I couldn't test this unfortunately, but I would suggest that if you have a lower tier CPU than the 14900K that we were running here for our test, you're probably going to run into a CPU bottleneck before you see this kind of performance increase. So just be mindful of that. You're probably going to be looking at a CPU upgrade as well as the graphics card upgrade to see what we saw here in our testing. So after this was where things started to get a little bit unhinged. So for the F124 tests, the Assetto Corsa Evo test, and the Le Mans Ultimate tests, we did run into CPU bottlenecking issues. So for F124, we were getting an average frame rate of hitting frame cap at 90 frames per second. And again, with F124, like I was saying with the 4K displays earlier, I do preference high frame rates here simply because there's so much going on the screen so quickly. I'm more willing to make visual quality sacrifices to get that high frame rate. So with the 4090, we are hitting frame cap at 90 frames per second with a 1% low of 69 frames per second. And GPU utilization there is at 75% because we are running into that CPU bottleneck when we have a full field of cars. You can get away with slightly higher frame rates with a lower bottleneck on the CPU with less cars on track, but I was actually still hitting a CPU bottleneck even when I was the only car on track. So we are at the limit of what the 14900K can do, even when overclocked here with even the 4090. So jumping up to the 5090 from there. Now, what was really interesting here, and similar to what we saw before, but to a more of an extreme extent, and again, I'm not 100% certain on the reason why here, but we actually saw slightly lower performance with the 5090 when CPU bottlenecked in comparison with the 4090. So 5090 was maxing out at 87 frames per second average with a 1% low. And we were getting a lot of micro stuttering with the 5090 that we weren't getting with the 4090. So 1% low here was 50 frames per second compared to the 69 frames per second that we were getting 1% low with the 4090. Now, interestingly here, the GPU utilization because of the CPU bottlenecking here was down to 75% with the 4090, which resulted in a power draw of just 280 watts average. But really interestingly here with the 5090, we were getting a lower frame rate of 87 frames per second, a much lower 1% low of 50 frames per second, but we were seeing a GPU utilization of 91.3% with a power draw of 478 watts. So way more power draw with the 5090 than we saw with the 4090, despite the lower performance. So yeah, again, I'm not going to pretend to fully understand the reason why that is, but that is what we saw in our testing. And if you do know the reason why, let us know in the comments down below. So Assetto Corsa Evo, this was another very strange one. I wasn't actually able to get this working at all with the 4090. I could get into the game, but then as soon as I loaded into the world, it would drop down to like 3 frames per second or less, and then just completely lock up the PC, and I have to Alt F4 the game to get out of it. So I was never able to get it to run with the 4090 in VR mode. Then when I switched over to the 5090 running the exact same in-game settings, the performance actually wasn't too bad. I got 66 frames per second average with the 5090 with a 1% low of 45 frames per second. And again, that was with the graphics turned up pretty high to get a good visual experience while still being at a playable frame rate. The power draw there was 460 watts with GPU utilization sitting at 93%. So we were ever so slightly CPU bound still there. We were seeing a couple of cores maxing out at 100%, but still pretty decent performance. And I'd be keen to see what kind of performance you could get out of a 9800 X3D or something like that. I would imagine you'd probably get a few more frames than what we were seeing with our overclocked 14900K. So yeah, I mean, the result there isn't really in line with what we saw anywhere else. Yeah, it didn't work at all with the 4090, but was, relatively okay with the 5090. And then in Le Mans Ultimate, again, we were running into some pretty heavy CPU bottlenecking, unfortunately, with the 14900K. So we were getting 66 frames per second average with a 1% low of 44 frames per second with the 4090, and a power draw of 333 watts with a GPU utilization of just over 90%. So yeah, again, as I said, CPU limited there. And then when we switched over to the 5090, we did see a slight increase there, a couple of percent, up to 70 frames per second, up from the 66 that we were seeing before, with a 1% low of 44, which was identical to the 4090. GPU utilization here, though, was down to 70%. So obviously we're running into a much harder CPU bound state with the 5090 than what we were with the 4090. But interestingly, unlike what we saw in iRacing, where we're hitting the 90 frames per second frame cap and saw lower power draw with the 5090 than we did with the 4090, in this case, we were sitting at 380 watts despite the lower utilization on the 5090 compared to the 333 watts that we were seeing on the 4090 at 90% utilization. So I'm guessing probably what's happening here is we're getting sudden bursts in performance. We're probably, waiting for the CPU to send through some data, then processing it really quickly and then dropping off again and kind of coming back and forth a little bit. I did notice that the frame rate was a little bit more erratic with the 5090 than it was with the 4090. And that to me kind of just makes sense. Again, I'm certainly not an expert here, but it would make sense that it was some sort of a bandwidth issue that was causing that sort of mismatch in power draw, GPU utilization, and frame rate here. So that was the situation with VR. Absolutely massive increase in performance where we weren't CPU bound in ACC. Everywhere else, pretty much, unfortunately, we were CPU bound. Now, I mean, you could argue that the tests are all invalid because we were running into a CPU bound state, and that is certainly the case. But the point of this video was to let you guys know what real world performance increase you could see from upgrading to a 5090 from a 4090. And the reality is, this is what we saw. So if you have a 14900K or something less than that, likely you're going to end up in a similar scenario to what we were seeing here if you are running a high-end headset like what we have here in the Pimax Crystal Lite. So that is the situation. A couple of other just quick things to mention here with regards to Pimax headsets as well. There is currently an issue with the 50 series graphics cards where if you try to use it with a Pimax headset, you have to disable the audio, the NVIDIA audio driver. Otherwise, you don't get any display output. So it just sits in screen off in the Pimax Play software. Yeah, disabling that NVIDIA audio driver does mean that the headset starts working, but then you don't have any audio through the headset. So you have to use a different audio output from your PC and use headphones or a speaker or something like that. So I know they are working on it. I have spoken to them and they're hoping to have a fix relatively soon, but at the time of actually making this video, there is that limitation. So I wanted to make sure that you guys were aware of that. The other thing just to quickly mention as well here, I'm sure there'll probably already be a couple of comments on the video from people asking why I wasn't running 120 Hertz mode on the Pimax Crystal Lite. Reason for that is quite simply that I do get quite a few visual glitches and, kind of weird stuff going on when running in that mode. And I find for my eyes, at least, the difference between 90 frames per second and 120 frames per second doesn't make a huge difference anyway. So I just prefer to run it at 90 Hertz. So that pretty much wraps things up here. When I am able to get my hands on a 5090 of my own, I will also do a big upgrade to our sim racing PC, probably chuck a 9800 X3D or something like that in it, in the hope that we can take full advantage of what the 5090 has to offer. We obviously have a lot more testing to do and experimenting with things like the frame generation that's now possible with the 50 series graphics cards as well. So that is definitely something that we can check out in future videos. But for now, I need to get this card back to Optimum Tech. So that's going to be it for 5090 content until I get my hands on my own one. But if you are lucky enough to have your hands on one of these cards, let us know what kind of performance increases you guys have seen and what you're upgrading from down in the comments as well. While you're down there, hit that thumbs up button as well if you found the video interesting or useful, or both. And make sure you subscribe to the channel as well so you don't miss out on future content. It always surprises me that only about 30% of the people that watch these videos are actually subscribed to the channel. And while I know that being subscribed to a channel doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to see more of them or less of them in your newsfeed, it is an awesome way of letting YouTube know that you find the content valuable, so it will show it to more sim racers like you. So we really do appreciate your support there. It's a really easy way that you can help support the channel without it costing you a cent. And if you are looking at picking up any sim racing gear, head over to boostedmedia.com optimumdigital.net to check out our discount codes and affiliate links. That is another awesome way of saving yourselves a little bit of cash and helping us out in the process as well. So thanks very much for watching, guys. And yeah, I'll see you again very soon. Bye.